Hello students, we're going to be talking about promoting social capital among your students, and three of the topics we're going to cover in relation to this are addressing labels, reflecting on our philosophy, and analyzing our literacy practices. We're doing this because when we're trying to address some big issues like this, we have to consider what our own pedagogical commitments are. And these three things are necessary if we're going to promote social capital. So this image to get you thinking, and what I like about this exercise is for you to think about yourself and what labels were put on you in school, and think about how some of the politics have changed in school settings, and maybe some of the labels might change over time, right? So I did this exercise with myself just to show you an example, but I encourage you to reflect on your own time. First off, when I was a student, these are all labels that could have been applied to me, or if I were to go back in time and be a student now, would be applied to me. So first off, I was not tardy, or I was not absent a lot, but I was tardy regularly. So that is often categorized as chronic absenteeism. At some points in my life, I would have fallen into what some might consider working class or a low socioeconomic situation. I would have been considered at risk because of certain situations, struggling with reading or being tardy a lot, or family situations, things like that. That leads to the trauma. All families go through trauma at some point in time, so we can all be labeled with that. It doesn't dictate what kind of student you are in the long run, but it does impact your abilities as a student at any given time in your life. Often nowadays, this wasn't the case when I was in school, but nowadays we have these categories where we label kids about how close they are to meeting the standard. So many times in my life, it would have been labeled standard nearly met. And currently, I have a hearing disability. So at the time when I was a student, I wasn't in this category. But if I were to go back in time now, they would have labeled me as a student with a disability or student with special needs because of that. So consider some of these things for yourself and think about what might you be labeled with. And I want you to consider, what does that really mean? Does it actually tell your story? I would say for myself, none of these labels actually tell my story about what kind of a student I turned out to be. So here are some of the common ones that we see in schools. A lot of times we talk about the achievement gap, and students are labeled as underperforming because of that achievement gap. We talk a lot about English learners. We hear that label EL applied to many students. And along with that, we often hear long-term EL, which I think is kind of funny, because anybody who has learned a second language would tell you that it's actually a lifelong journey to aspire to be completely bilingual. There's actually not one moment in time when you feel like you finally got it. You just become better and better at it, like even in your first language. No one feels like they know every word or speaks perfectly, right? So all of that is a lifelong effort. So to put a label on the term is really inappropriate if you think about it. At-risk students is something that is a common label that I think is completely inappropriate. It doesn't really tell us anything. If we think about what we're saying the student is at risk of, what do we really mean? Probably we mean at risk of failure. And what we really mean by that is we haven't figured out how to best serve that student. So we should be considering not whether they're at risk of failure, but are we capable of meeting those needs? And so instead of putting the onus on students, we need to put it back on ourselves as educators. And so I would advocate that we consider removing all the labels off of children and try some of these new terms. Now, achievement gap is not often applied to a student, but a situation. And so many scholars are now calling that the opportunity gap, because it takes the onus off of students and puts it on our system. Our education system needs to address that gap, not the students. The second one, instead of saying English learner or long-term English learner, we should just say bilingual student, because bilingualism is a long process. It is not something that happens at any one moment in a short period of time. We can call everybody bilingual who is on that journey. Okay, and finally, instead of saying students who are at risk, we should just say students, because at some point in time, everybody struggles with something. And so labeling students in that manner can be a real problem that label might linger and kind of stick with them for a long time. We don't want that. Next, we need to consider our own philosophy. Right here, you'll see on this image here on the left that we have some of the major philosophies in education: perennialism, essentialism, progressivism, and reconstructivism, or reconstructionism. I've heard it said both ways. And so with that philosophy, whichever one you align with, you need to think about the process of first dropping those labels and what does that mean for your philosophy? Why would you do it? And then consider why you're doing what you're doing when you make big decisions about your classroom. So many of us would call ourselves progressivism or progressivist teachers, right? So many of us would categorize ourselves as that. Not all of us, but many of us. I would say that that's probably the majority. When I give time for students to assess which category they most align with, many select this one. So progressive education requires that teachers are allowed opportunities to design curriculum and instructional practices that allow them to teach the whole child. And so that's essentially what progressivism is. We're considering the whole child and everything related to that child's education. And so given that, if you are a true progressive educator, those labels are even less relevant to you, right? And even more cause to get rid of them. Here is a quote from John Dewey. And John Dewey is one of the main thinkers and major philosophers when it comes to progressive education. He says, "Finally, I saw how inconsistent it was to expect this greater amount of creative, independent work from the student when the teachers are still unemancipated, when the teachers were still shackled by too many rules and prescriptions and too much of a desire for uniformity of method and subject matter." So in other words, if the teachers are constantly shackled, as he would say, or held to a one-size-fits-all approach, then it's almost impossible to be a true progressive educator. That's what we're aspiring to. We know that you can't go out and change all the rules, but you can challenge them when appropriate. And so if we start with changing those labels and getting rid of them, and then we embrace educating the whole child, and we start challenging some of these one-size-fits-all approaches, we might better promote social capital among our students. Okay, so that leads us to the more practical information of instructional practices. So how do we actually do it? Well, first off, you might have heard this phrase before, but we often hear people talk about how we need to decolonize our education. If you look at American history and how the United States came about and our past, there's a lot of colonization that occurred. That is why our government exists and why our culture struggles with certain aspects of racism and classism that are still entrenched in our school system. And so we need to decolonize our education system, meaning we need to start thinking outside of those systems that perpetuate that colonial mindset of control or oppression or power. So here are some things that can be associated with decolonizing education: better representation in teaching and leadership, open dialogue about race and racism in our practices, critique of the curriculum, restore cultural knowledge and links to the community, foster strength, healing, and reflection, and promote rigorous learning activities. These are all things that might go along with that process of decolonizing our education system. In other words, we don't want to stick with the same systems that have been in place just because we're used to doing it that way. So here's a little reminder that the California standards for the teaching profession actually ask, if you look at this last little statement down here, that teachers have an understanding of their students' individual strengths, interests, and needs, and knowledge about their families and communities. So that leads us to one of my favorite topics, which is funds of knowledge. It is not just something that we say is good or positive, it's actually what the state tells us we must do as part of our job. The teaching performance expectations, you should be familiar with the TPEs by now. TPE 1 actually lists funds of knowledge as one of the goals for our performance expectations among new teachers. So here's our definition of funds of knowledge. Historically accumulated and culturally developed bodies of knowledge and skill, essential for household and individual functioning and well-being. Many of you have probably heard of this before. You've probably heard other instructors talk about it in their classes. And I would encourage you to keep exploring methods for implementing funds of knowledge. I'm going to give you a few examples and ideas here, not going to spend a ton of time, but you can also download this presentation and look at them in more detail if you like. And I would encourage you to do more research on this on your own time as well. So 3 main ways you can use funds of knowledge is through your curriculum, through literacy strategies, and through building relationships with students. Now, I'm not going to read all these to you, but if you want to, I'd suggest again that you download the presentation or you pause this and read through them yourself. Here's an example. Many of you have probably seen me point this one out before, but this is an example of why we should challenge our curriculum. This is a photo I took from my nephew's book that he brought from school. It was home reading, independent reading that he was assigned, and the book was about explorers. And so we see that racism is entrenched in our curriculum, and it favors certain groups that have oppressed other groups. It favors people who have made atrocious mistakes that hurt others. And often in the United States, our curriculum tends to have this problem where we water down these oppressive acts and we kind of act like they were neutral or subjective. We act often like these decisions to hurt other groups of people was out of politics or purely economics, when in fact there's a lot of racism entrenched in those decisions as well. And so we need to challenge that. And the way you would challenge something like this, let's say you're an elementary school teacher and you have this in your textbook, what would you do? So you need to challenge it by going further. Here's an example of a primary source. Again, I'm not going to read it to you, but you can pause it and read this for yourself. This is an excerpt from a primary source, meaning it was from the original author. So this is written by Christopher Columbus. This is a letter he wrote shortly after he made that long journey, not to North America, but to the West Indies. And so you can pause and read this, and you'll see that, in fact, if you compare what was said about him here and what he said about what he was doing and how it was going, are 2 different stories. So I encourage you to pause it and take a look. All right, so if we're going to consider then practical ways we can actually use students' funds of knowledge. Remember, we're trying to build social capital. We remove some labels, we stop using them altogether. We just drop them, stop using them, find new words that work better if we have to label students at all. A lot of times you don't need to, we're just kind of used to it. We analyze our philosophy and realize why we're doing something, and then we have to look at our practices. So these are some practical ways that teachers can tap into students' funds of knowledge. As I go through these, I'm going to go through very quickly. I'm not going to read them in detail, but you can pause or you can download the presentation yourself. So often I would suggest that people try their best to relate questions that you ask students about their personal background. Can you ask them questions related to the content that will connect to things that they've experienced? Maybe open-ended questions instead of multiple choice or right or wrong or true false. Again, open-ended questions are some examples of how you might ask those. I would suggest, if you don't know much about your students, to send home surveys, or if they're old enough, ask them to fill out some surveys for you. Definitely implementing some cooperative learning and allowing students to play different roles in your class and engaging in groups to complete things and to construct knowledge, not just to complete an assignment, but to come up with new ideas together. You definitely want to implement time for reflection. Anyone who has learned a second language will tell you that added time for reflection and added time to think and process is very important. And beyond just our students who are bilingual, also among our other students that might just need that extra time to think, students with learning disabilities or students who are personally going through a trauma, often that impacts how quickly you can understand new concepts or process new things. It affects memory, it affects mood. All those things are important. So extra time for students to reflect and process information is very important. There are some suggestions down here that I would ask you to take a moment and read through and take note of. And so as we think about these things and how we would approach literacy instruction, I suggest that you consider how literacy is very personal. So as students are on that process of developing their linguistic skills, their reading, their writing, their oral language, all of those things are very personal in the process. And here's an excerpt from one of your readings in this class. that talks about how, like all linguistic communication, academic language involves challenges at the level of self-representation, representing a message, constructing discourse, and composing utterances. All of those are very personal processes that take place throughout literacy. And so I went ahead and added some questions for you to think about. If you were the student and you were given a task or an agenda or something to complete, uh, can you answer those questions given that task? Okay, and that is what you need to think about as far as how to scaffold that information, how to scaffold that process and those skills for those students who are trying to expand their literacy in a way that is going to make it comfortable for them, right? And when we say literacy is personal, we mean that it is really highly dependent upon how you personally, socially, and psychologically interact with that environment and with the text and with the activity you're doing. And if any of those pieces are negative or traumatizing or just unwelcoming, then it's very unlikely that students will gain that additional academic vocabulary that they're trying to add as they grow in their literacy skills. So just to recap, some of the commitments we think might help us build social capital is replacing labels with new language, reflecting on our philosophy, and analyzing our practices when we're doing literacy instruction. And in case social capital is new to you, there is a definition right there in that blue box for you. I'm sure you've heard it before, but if you wanted to see the actual definition from the original authors, I would suggest you check that out. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope this was helpful to just give you an overview of some ideas that we've been discussing in class and will continue to discuss.